Denis Cyplenkov is one of the strongest arm wrestlers who has ever lived. Some would say he may even be the strongest arm wrestler who has ever lived. During Denis's peak, he was so far out ahead of the pack that no one was even able to pin him. In 2018, Denis crushed Devin Larratt without even trying. But shortly after this, Denis started having severe health problems and lost a significant amount of strength. It was unclear if Denis would ever come back to the sport, and even if he did make a comeback, it seemed unlikely that he could regain his peak level. But recently, we've seen Denis performing very well against top athletes. I don't think that Denis is stronger overall than his 2018 form. However, his technical abilities are vastly different. In this video, I will explain why I think Denis Cyplenkov may surpass his previous peak level, even if he is smaller and weaker than he used to be. One of the most famous rivalries in the sport is Denis Cyplenkov versus John Brzenk. Their very first match was all the way back in 2008. In this match, we were able to see that Denis was massive and super strong. But Denis's technique looked very robotic. In this stage of Denis's career, we see that his entire game plan relied on his bicep strength and his wrist curl strength. If Denis could get his wrist bent and force the match into a hook, his bicep was so strong that almost no one could pin him. So Denis would take a low grip and put everything he had into turning the match into a hook. But John's top roll was able to prevent Denis from fully bending his wrist. Denis could not gain access to his power and was defeated. After this match, Denis did not necessarily make significant changes in his technique. Instead, he simply got bigger and stronger. In 2009, Denis arm wrestled John again. This time, he may have looked closer in power, but John's technique was still far superior. John was able to deny Denis access to his power and won the match once again. After this, Denis still did not refine his technique very much, but he got even bigger and even stronger. And in 2010, it all paid off. This time, Denis was able to bend his wrist against John and force him into a hook. As soon as Denis set the hook, he gained access to all of his power and was able to rip through John. After this, Denis jumped 47 meters into the air and broke the stage. Later in 2011, we saw Denis pull Richard Lubke's. Denis continued to show us that he was incredibly strong, but his primary strategy was still to force people into a hook. Denis's bicep was the strongest in the world, but he was still struggling to bend his wrist. The problem is that Denis's hand is so thick that there is a high amount of separation between the hands. This creates more torque on the wrist and makes it more difficult for Denis to bend his wrist. So Denis attempting to force a hook on his opponents did not really make sense from an anatomical perspective. The thickness of Denis's hand gave him much more potential as a top roller, but Denis was so strong he could pretty much do whatever he wanted. In 2010, Denis fought with Andrei Pushkar. In this match, we again see Denis with his standard low grip focusing all of his efforts into bending his wrist in order to access his inside power. But as the match went on, Denis's wrist began to gas out. This forced him to pull using more of an outside lane. Denis used somewhat of a top roll here, but it almost looked like more of a Todd Hutchings style side pressure. He still was not making full use of his crazy strong elbow flexor, but instead he was very offensive and was surging toward his own pin pad, losing hand control in the process. But once again, Denis was so strong that it didn't matter. Eventually, he was able to win with an awkward looking flop press. But then in 2013, Denis did something different. He had a match with Dave Chafee and initially took a low grip and attempted to hold on to Dave just like he always did. This did not work out very well for Denis. After this, Denis decided to go ahead and take a high grip and go for a top roll. Denis's wrist did not gas out and he was not forced into an outside move. This time, he intentionally set up for an outside move from the start and it worked perfectly. Denis used his crazy strong elbow flexor in tandem with his crazy thick hand to generate massive torque on Dave's wrist. Dave's wrist cracked back and he was no longer able to access his power. In my mind, the open top roll we see here from Denis is Denis's best move. It makes the most sense for him anatomically, and I also think he has had the best results using it. Despite the potential Denis showed using this new technique, he did end up going back to his roots of inside arm wrestling for a while longer. Denis pulled Dave Chafee again in 2014 and used his classic low grip hook setup. And again, we saw that Dave did very well against Denis. This match turned into an all-out war as Denis essentially gifted Dave full access to his power using this setup. Eventually, Denis was able to grind out the win in this match, but it was by no means a free win. Denis continued to dominate the scene using what many would consider to be a suboptimal technique. This eventually led to his match in 2018 with Devin Larratt. Denis taking a low grip and attempting to force a hook on Devin was certainly not the correct technical option, but Denis was just so strong that it didn't really matter if his technique was correct. There was enough of a strength gap that Devin just could not do anything. We did see Devin try multiple techniques and multiple setups, but none of it made any difference. Denis was just too powerful. And at this time, Denis likely had reached the peak of his career. This is when Denis lifted 87.5 kilos on back pressure for 3 reps, which to this day has not been broken using the exact same technique shown in this video. But unfortunately, this is when Denis's health really started to suffer. He lost a significant amount of weight and strength and was unable to push himself very hard, as this would be a major health risk for him. But Denis did not give up. He always talked about coming back to the sport, although I don't know how many of us actually expected it. But Denis believed in himself. We began to see Denis incorporating some light training here and there, but nothing serious. Denis gradually started to increase the intensity of his training. But this is when we started to see something very encouraging. Denis knew that he probably could not get as big as he once was. This time around, he was not going to be the brute force guy that was just bigger and stronger than everyone. Denis needed to maximize his technical abilities. Just like we saw for a moment back in 2013 against Dave Chafee, Denis was now using the open top roll as his leading weapon in practice. In the past, his leading weapon was low grip inside arm wrestling with offensive surges, but Denis had completely changed his technique. Not only was he focusing on his open top roll, but he was also being much more defensive. By being defensive, Denis was protecting his wrist instead of cracking his own wrist back by surging toward the pin pad like we had seen in the past. At this point, Denis was still clearly not as big or strong as he was, but he was making up for it by being smarter. Denis continued to progress in strength, now using a much more optimal technique than he had in the past. Eventually, we saw him practice pull with Zaur Paisalayev, who had been crushing everyone at the time. Although Zaur did seem to be a level above Denis, we did see that Denis was very strong. If Denis could get a stop in his defensive open top roll lane, Zaur could not move Denis at all. This is another moment where we really got to see how effective Denis had become. Again, he may not have been as strong as he used to be in terms of maximal weights, but his technique had become so much better. If Denis was able to gain connection to his power, even Zaur was unable to do anything. The combination of Denis's back pressure and pronation through his thumb had just become ridiculous. And this was not even the end. At this time, Denis had an upcoming match with John Brzenk at King of the Table, and he still had more time to train. And at this point, people really were starting to think of Denis as the massive favorite against John, and for good reason. When Denis finally got to pull John one more time, he did everything I hoped he would. He did not try to hold on to John, he was not offensive early, and he used his endurance to bleed John out. He led with his open top roll and just sat in that position and allowed John's wrist and bicep to gas out completely. Only after John had lost a significant amount of strength did Denis become offensive. To be fair, Denis may have rushed things a bit in certain moments of the match. After all, it was his first match in years. But in my opinion, his overall strategy was perfect. I think this match versus John is the first match of Denis's career where he truly embraced the open top roll. The moment where Denis truly let go of his former technique. And going forward, I think that this will be the new Denis Cyplenkov. No longer holding on to his opponent and doing everything he can to force the match inside, but now embracing his natural gifts, never holding on and putting everything into winning the battle of back pressure and cracking his opponent's wrist. So can Denis reach his former level of strength and surpass his peak of 2018? I'm not sure if we will ever see a stronger version of Denis than we have in the past. However, I think it is very likely that we will see a better version of Denis. A version of Denis that would defeat the Denis of the past. He may not be bigger or stronger overall, but he can be stronger in the areas that really matter. He is also a much smarter and more efficient puller. I'm so excited to see what the future holds for Denis Cyplenkov. He truly is one of the most gifted strength athletes in history, and he is now fully transitioned to the technique that gives him the most potential. Let me know what you guys think about this, but it would not surprise me at all if Denis is able to reach a new peak because of this. Even during his comeback, the sky is still the limit for Denis.